This is important. What I'm about to show you took me 20 years to piece together. Spinoza saw it 400 years ago. The church tried to destroy it. Don't click away until you've seen the evidence.
Right. I want to tell you about the last Christmas I spent believing that date meant what I had always been told it meant. It was a Sunday morning, Norwich, the Church of St. Peter Mancroft, which is a medieval building on the market square. And if you have ever sat inside it in December, you will know that the stone holds the cold the way nothing else does. The pews have that particular quality of cold that comes not from the air, but from centuries of it being absorbed into the material itself. I had a good coat and I was still cold. The choir was singing, the candles were lit. Everything was exactly as it should have been, which is to say that everything was exactly as it had always been. And I already knew. I spent the better part of the previous 8 months working through a chain of evidence that I'm going to lay out for you in this conversation. By that December morning, I had followed it as far as it would go. And I sat in that pew with the familiar hymns going up into the medieval vault above me. And I sang the words I had sung since childhood. And I felt something that I still find difficult to describe precisely. Not grief, not exactly. More like the particular loneliness of knowing something that changes what a room means, while being inside that room, while the room is full of people for whom it has not changed. 3 things. That is what I want to give you today. 3 things that Spinoza established about the 25th of December that the institutions responsible for maintaining that date have never adequately answered. And the third one, I should tell you now, is the one I stayed with longest. The third one is the one that does not stay quiet. But before I get there, I need to tell you something about the text. Because the problem with December 25th does not begin with Rome. It does not begin with pagan festivals or imperial politics. It begins much earlier, and it begins in a place you would not expect. It begins with the shepherds. Stop for a moment and consider what we actually know from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, verse 8. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. That is the verse, that is the scene. The shepherds, the fields, the night. Now here is what I need you to hold in your mind before we go any further. This is not a scene set in a warm climate. This is Judea. The Judean highlands around Bethlehem sit at approximately 760 meters above sea level. In December, the average overnight temperature in that region runs between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius. It is not England in December, but it is cold in a way that matters agriculturally, because Judean shepherds followed a practice documented extensively in rabbinic literature and in the agricultural records of the region, of bringing their flocks in from open fields from roughly October through to March. The flocks were penned, not because the shepherds were lazy, but because the combination of cold, predators, and wet ground made open field grazing untenable. Shepherds keeping watch over flocks in open fields at night is a spring and summer scene. It is not a December scene. I am not the first person to notice this. A number of biblical scholars working independently have observed the same agricultural incongruity. But what I want to do is push past the incongruity to the calculation beneath it, because this is where it gets interesting. There is a text, First Chronicles chapter 24, verse 10. It is a passage that receives almost no attention in popular theological discussion, which is itself telling, because what it contains is a complete schedule of the priestly divisions that served in the Jerusalem temple. There were 24 divisions in total. Each served for 1 week, twice a year. And the 8th division, the division named Abijah, had its rotations assigned. Zacharias, the father of John the Baptist, was a priest of the division of Abijah. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Zacharias was serving in the temple when the angel appeared to him, and that shortly after his return home, Elizabeth conceived John the Baptist. If you follow the priestly rotation forward, the division of Abijah served in the Hebrew month of Sivan, which falls roughly in our May to June. If Elizabeth conceived in June, John would have been born approximately 9 months later, in March. And then the same gospel tells us that when Mary became pregnant with Jesus, Elizabeth was already 6 months along. 6 months after John's March birth puts the birth of Jesus in approximately March of the following year. That is the calculation. According to one reading of the Abijah division schedule, and it is the reading that Spinoza's textual methodology most closely supports, the evidence does not point to December. It points to spring, most likely March. Simple. Except there is a second reading, and there always is. The texts are not as tidy as that calculation suggests. Luke and Matthew tell stories that contain internal contradictions that I want to be honest with you about, because what I am building here depends on not hiding the difficulty. Matthew places the birth of Jesus during the reign of Herod the Great. Herod died in the year 4 before the Common Era. Luke places the same birth at the time of a census conducted by a Roman official named Quirinius. The historical records are clear that Quirinius governed Syria and conducted a census in the year 6 of the Common Era. That is a 10-year gap between the two accounts. It is not a small discrepancy. It is not a copyist error or a translation problem. It is a structural incompatibility between two accounts that cannot both be historically accurate. I am telling you this not to undermine the faith of anyone listening, but because what I'm about to show you about the calendar calculation cannot be fairly understood without first acknowledging that the gospel texts themselves do not agree on the basic chronological framework. Both Matthew and Luke are doing something important and valuable, but neither of them was writing what the 21st century would recognize as a documentary chronological record. They were writing theology. And when you understand that, the calendar question opens in a way that it cannot if you are trying to force the texts into a historical precision they were not designed to carry. So, yes. The shepherds suggest spring. The Abijah division calculation suggests March. Luke and Matthew contradict each other on the year and on the surrounding political circumstances. The case for December 25th, before we have even reached the first century of our history, is already on uncertain ground. And then there is a document, written around 221 of the Common Era, by a scholar named Sextus Julius Africanus. I want to tell you about the afternoon I first worked through that document properly. It was in a library, one of the large institutional ones, the kind with long tables and fluorescent lights that are technically adequate, but have a quality of flatness that discourages comfort. I had requested a working text of the Chronographiae, which is Africanus's attempt to construct a complete chronology of human history, from the creation through to his own time. I had a coffee going cold beside me, and a notepad with increasingly small handwriting as the afternoon wore on. What Africanus does in that text, and what I had been told about in outline but had never followed through in detail, is present for the first time in recorded Christian literature, a specific rationale for the date of December 25th. The logic is this. March 25th was, in his cosmological framework, the date of the spring equinox. The equinox was a moment of perfect divine proportion, the equal division of light and darkness, which made it, in his theological reasoning, the date of the Annunciation, the moment of Jesus' conception. 9 months after March 25th is December 25th. I put the text down. I looked at the fluorescent light for a moment. I picked it up again. What Africanus had produced was not a historical document about when Jesus was born. It was a calculation derived from a theological premise about the perfection of divinely significant dates. The argument ran, in essence, that spiritually important events should fall at cosmologically important moments, that the equinox was such a moment, and that the most reasonable assumption was therefore that Jesus was conceived then. 9 months later, December 25th. That is not an historical record. That is a theological preference expressed as arithmetic. The building that had seemed solid, the sense that December 25th was preserved somewhere in an ancient source, was not resting on the foundation I had assumed. It was resting on a calculation made 2 centuries after the events in question, by a scholar working from a premise about divine numerical perfection, not evidence, a framework. A colleague, the scholar Hippolytus of Rome, writing at roughly the same time, confirms the same calculation. 2 scholars, same period, same method, same conclusion. They are not corroborating independent historical sources. They are corroborating each other's cosmological logic. Now, what I'm about to show you about this calculation cannot be dismissed as coincidence. It matters not only for the date, but for everything that follows. Because once you understand that December 25th was produced by theological mathematics rather than historical record, the behavior of the institutions around that date takes on a different character entirely. The second thing that Spinoza identified in his analysis was this: the relationship between December 25th and the existing structure of Roman midwinter observance is not as simple as the popular version suggests, and the popular version is already damaging enough. In 354 of the Common Era, a document was produced in Rome, known to scholars as the Philocalian calendar, after the calligrapher who prepared it. It is, among other things, a list of festivals and observances, and in it, on the 25th of December, there appears a reference to a celebration connected to the Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a deity associated with the official Roman imperial cult. This is the evidence that is most often cited when people make the claim that Christmas was stolen from a pagan sun god festival. But here is what I need to tell you. That document dates to 354. Christians had been gathering to observe the birth of Jesus on or around that date for at least 150 years by the time that calendar was compiled. The relationship between the Christian observance and the Sol Invictus observance is historically more complicated than a simple direction of borrowing. There are scholars who argue that the Sol Invictus observance was itself partly shaped by Christian influence, that the direction of adoption ran both ways, that the question of who borrowed from whom is not cleanly resolved by the Philocalian calendar alone. I tell you this because I want to be precise. The clean version of this story, the Church stole December 25th from a pagan sun god, is not the full version. The full version is messier and, in its own way, more revealing. So the Church borrowed December 25th from Sol Invictus. That is the clean version, except the clean version is not the full version. The fuller picture involves the Saturnalia, the Roman midwinter festival that ran from the 17th to the 23rd of December, and the Brumalia, a cycle of festivities that preceded it from late November. You're looking at a period of roughly a month in the Roman calendar that was saturated with midwinter celebration, gift exchange, the lighting of lamps and candles, communal feasting, the decoration of homes with evergreen plants. The cultural machinery of midwinter festival was deeply embedded in the population that the early church was attempting to reach. And here is where something important survives. A note, not in a major text or a celebrated theological work, but in a marginal annotation written by a bishop named Dionysius Barsalibi in the 12th century. Barsalibi, writing in Syriac, states explicitly that early Christians originally observed the birth of Jesus on the 6th of January, and that the date was moved to the 25th of December to coincide with an existing pagan festival. He is not celebrating this fact. He is noting it in the margin of his manuscript, in the way that someone notes a thing that is known but rarely spoken, a document that by any reckoning should not have survived, a note in a margin that someone, somewhere, decided was not worth destroying. There is a document from the 6th century, and I will come back to it, that makes the mechanism behind that note explicit, in a way that should not be possible to ignore. But before I get there, I need to tell you what Spinoza actually identified in all of this, because it is not what you might expect. What I want to say about Spinoza is what I should be precise about. What his analysis in the Tractatus makes clear, and it took me several years to follow his reasoning properly through the relevant sections, is that the calendar adjustment is not best understood as theft. It is best understood as a specific and deliberate application of a principle that he identified operating throughout the history of religious institutions. The principle is this. Spinoza argued, working through the example of Moses as a political and legislative figure, that the most effective way to reshape the practices of a population is not to confront those practices directly, but to occupy them. Moses, in Spinoza's reading, did not abolish Egyptian ritual structure. He worked within it, adapted it, redirected its cultural energy toward different theological ends. The framework remained recognizable. The content was gradually transformed. The population did not experience a rupture. They experienced a continuity that was, in its deep structure, a substitution. I want to tell you about a conversation I had at a conference. It was in the north of England. the early years of this century, one of those patristics gatherings where the papers are dense and the coffee is institutional and the most important things are said in corridors between sessions. I was standing near the end of a long hallway, between a panel on early liturgical sources and the coffee break that everyone had been waiting for. A specialist I respected, someone who had spent decades working on the interface between early Christianity and late Roman religious culture, was walking past with a folder of papers under their arm. They said, almost as an aside, not stopping, "The question was never whether December 25th was historically accurate. Everyone in this room knows it wasn't. The question is what you do with a population that has already converted their celebrations." Spinoza understood that. Rome understood that. They were working from the same playbook, and then they went to get coffee. I stayed in that corridor for a while. The conference noise continued around me. What stayed with me was the casual certainty of it, the implication that this was not a contested point among serious scholars, that the historical inaccuracy of the date was, in that room, simply assumed, and that the interesting question was the institutional one. What do you do with a population whose midwinter celebrations have become structurally load-bearing? Knowing this changes how you experience every Christmas service permanently. I say that not to alarm you, but because it is true, and because you deserve to know it before you continue. The answer that Rome gave, and the answer that Spinoza identified as a consistent pattern in the operation of religious institutions, is that you do not argue the population out of a calendar. You convert the calendar itself. You do not convince people to stop celebrating at midwinter. You tell them what they are celebrating. That is the third thing, and the Council of Tours in 567 of the Common Era makes the mechanism explicit in a way that nothing else does. That council, meeting in the Frankish kingdom, issued a declaration that the 12 days between December 25th and the 6th of January constituted a single unified sacred season, that they were obligatory as a Christian observance, and that the population was expected to treat them as such. The ecclesiastical significance of those 12 days was not derived from any text of the New Testament. It was derived from the administrative decision to contain within a Christian framework the entire duration of the Saturnalian calendar that had governed midwinter celebration for centuries. 12 days. The Saturnalia ran for 7 days. The Roman calends of January ran for several days of gift exchange and celebration. The Brumalia extended the midwinter period for weeks. The 12 days of Christmas are, in their structure, the ecclesiastical envelope placed around a period of observance that was already there. I want to be honest with you about how uncomfortable the implications of this are, because I lived with them, and I know what they feel like. Each individual element of what we now call the Christmas tradition carries a traceable history that does not originate in Judea in the 1st century. The evergreen tree, particularly the pine or fir, enters midwinter observance from the religious practices of Phrygia, specifically the cult associated with the deity Attis, whose mythology is structured around a pine tree and a midwinter death and rebirth cycle. The practice of lighting candles as a central ritual element of midwinter celebration comes from the Saturnalia, where the illumination of darkness was a core observance. The exchange of gifts at the turning of the year was a practice associated with the Roman calends of January, the first days of the new year, documented extensively in Roman satirical writing as a commercial and social institution. Holly and other winter-burying plants entered the tradition from pre-Christian Celtic observance in the northern provinces. What I am describing is not contamination. I want to be clear about that. I am not suggesting that a pure Christian practice was corrupted by pagan intrusion. What Spinoza identified, and what the historical record supports, is that the practice was constructed from these elements deliberately by people who understood what they were doing, because population-level religious transformation works through the occupation of existing cultural structures, not through their erasure. A scholar named Jonathan Z. Smith, working in the latter half of the 20th century, wrote a study of the apparatus of comparison in early Christian scholarship that addresses this directly. His argument, which I found clarifying, is that the question of Christian-pagan parallels was systematically excluded from mainstream theological scholarship, not because the parallels were not there, but because acknowledging them fully would require a different kind of honesty about the nature of institutional religious formation than mainstream theology had been willing to sustain. The absence of that apparatus from academic theology, in his analysis, is itself a datum. The silence around these questions is not neutral. I am aware that there are people for whom what I am describing will feel like an attack on something they love. I want to address that directly before I close, because it is the part of this that I have thought about the longest. The evidence for a spring birth, most likely in March based on the Abijah division calculation, is not the same as evidence that the person described in those gospel accounts did not exist, or did not matter, or was not who the tradition says he was. A date is not a doctrine. The calendar is an institution. And what Spinoza's method, at its most useful, insists on is the distinction between the institutional layer of religion and the experiential or philosophical core that the institution claims to represent. When I sat in St. Peter Mancroft that December morning, already knowing what I knew, I was not in the presence of a fraudulent tradition. I was in the presence of a very old and very human institution doing what all old human institutions do, which is to say that it was continuing to do what it had always done, in the form that it had settled into over centuries, carrying within it the accumulated decisions of people who were trying to manage the transmission of something they believed in through the conditions of their own time. The 25th of December is a political date. It was produced by theological mathematics in the 3rd century, occupied a pre-existing slot in the Roman midwinter calendar, was formally consolidated by institutional decree in the 6th century, and carries with it a series of cultural elements that were absorbed from the surrounding observance tradition. That is the historical record. And here is what I have come to believe the historical record does not determine: whether the story being told on that date has value, whether the thing being celebrated, the arrival of something new into human experience, something that changes the terms of the question being asked about what life means, deserves the celebration that has accumulated around it. Spinoza's own position, which is worth understanding clearly, was not that the institutions of religion were worthless. It was that they had allowed themselves to be confused with the thing they were meant to transmit. The calendar is not the conviction. The institution is not the insight. When you clear away the institutional overlay and look at what is underneath it, you may find something that you value more or less than you expected, but at least you are looking at it clearly. I still go to church at Christmas occasionally. I sing the hymns, the stone is still cold, but I am not singing them the same way I was before, and I am not sure I would want to be. What you do with this is entirely your own decision. I have given you the evidence as I followed it. The Abijah division in First Chronicles pointing to a spring birth. The Chronographiae of Africanus showing December 25th as a calculation rather than a historical record. The Philocalian calendar and the complex relationship between midwinter observance and early Christian practice. The marginal note of Bar Salibi, the Council of Tours in 567. Spinoza's identification of the institutional mechanism that connects all of them. You are capable of following that evidence to your own conclusion. I am confident of that. And whatever conclusion you reach will be more yours, more genuinely held, than whatever you were holding before you watched this. Right, take care of yourselves.
If you know someone still trapped in religious fear, someone who needs to know the historical truth, share this with them, anonymously if you have to. Sometimes one video changes everything.